Throughout the Second World War, the aviation industry within Australia evolved. However, in the mid-1930s, Australia could barely manufacture a car, let alone an aircraft. But during the war, Australia produced some of the most advanced aircraft in existence. The CAC Kangaroo was no exception, being the most powerful piston-driven aircraft Australia ever produced. Sadly, it was built too late for action in World War II, and at a time where jet aircraft were being, well, the undeniable future. In 1936, the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation was formed. It allowed Australia to become self-reliant in aircraft and engine production in case of war. And, well, if cut off from the outside world, it would allow the company to go on. And the company would go on to create such designs such as the CAC Wirraway and the famous CAC Boomerang. See my video here about the Boomerang. Anyhow, in 1942, CAC set to improve upon the Boomerang's performance, and testing they had done with the Boomerang fighter prototypes, in which a 1700 horsepower Wright 2600 engine was put in place of the 1200 Pratt and Whitney R1830. However, the needed modifications to the Boomerang's airframe proved to be too substantial, and since, well, the needed to be an improved fighter was still pressing, CAC embarked on, well, to design an entirely new aircraft in November 1942. This new fighter was designated the CA-15. The design of the Kangaroo incorporated an R2800 engine, and the aircraft resembled a cross between a Boomerang and a Focke-Wulf 190A. This design would ultimately change, however, as then it did resemble a Hawker Tempest 2 with squared-off wings and tail, but with a General Electric GE-C turbocharger installed at the rear fuselage, similar to the Republic P-47. Keep in mind that the R2800 was capable of producing 2,000 horsepower. In mid-1943, however, CAC was informed that the engine would not be available, so they redesigned the Kangaroo to use the R2800 10W, the same engine used by the F6 Hellcat, which approximately made 2,300 horsepower. Unfortunately, this engine utilised superchargers instead of a turbocharger, which meant the CA-15 could no longer be a high-altitude fighter, instead specialising in a mid to low-level combat. The development of the aircraft was then further slowed when CAC was granted license to produce the North American Mustang. Lawrence Wackett, the CAC's general manager, envisioned the CA-17/CA-18 filling the high-altitude fighter role, and the CA-15 covering the low and mid-altitudes. After all, the Mustang was en route to becoming one of the Allies' key fighter aircraft, and getting them into service with the Royal Australian Air Force was, well, in number more important of an aircraft than was, well, an aircraft that was still some ways away from service. After another engine redesign and being told that the Double Wasp 10W was not available, they would have to use the R2800-57, which used a turbocharger, which also meant redesigning the whole entire fuselage to fit in the new parts. The project was around 50% complete when Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation got told they could not use the R2800-57. An ironic twist of fate set out seeking another replacement engine. CAC then approached Rolls-Royce, hoping that they might have an engine capable of producing over 2,000 horsepower. What was chosen was the Griffon 125 that was under development. The water-cooled Griffon had a two-stage, 3-speed supercharger and turned a single rotation propeller. A redesign of the aircraft was also needed to facilitate the need for a new engine. As such, the cowling was completed, a scoop to house the radiators for the engine coolant and oil was incorporated under the aircraft, and with these changes the CA-15 resembled a P-51D Mustang, but the resemblance was purely coincidental. The design looked beefy with its teardrop canopy, the massive underbelly air scoop, followed by its square-clipped wings. It also incorporated fully retractable landing gear and flaps that were hydraulically operated. The top speed of the aircraft was estimated to be about 405 miles an hour at sea level, which is about 652 kilometers an hour. At 18,000 feet or 5,487 meters, the aircraft could do 467 miles an hour or 752 kilometers an hour, and the initial climb rate was 27.9 meters a second, about 5,500 feet per minute. But then more bad news hit. The Australian War Cabinet cancelled the CA-15 contract in September of 1944. With this major blowback, CAC continued development. Rolls-Royce, however, providing another blow by not being able to provide the Rolls-Royce Griffon 125 until late 1945. Work still continued while CAC worked with the War Cabinet to reinstate the program. The company did not wait for a new engine to show up. Instead, they took two Rolls-Royce 2,035 horsepower Griffon 61s, which had 2-speed supercharger. Engines that were used in later model Spitfires, this engine would be the aircraft's final engine. By this time, the Kangaroo was also supporting various offensive armament combinations. Initially, the designers wanted to feature 4 20mm Spano cannons with 140 rounds per gun. However, it was fitted with 650 caliber machine guns, adding up to about 250 rounds per gun. Although in the documentation from CAC that number varies considerably, up to 290 rounds per gun, as the guns were not installed until a few months after the aircraft's first flight. Underwing provisions called for 2 1,000-pound or 450-kilogram bombs, or 2 additional 120-gallon or 454-litre drop tanks, plus the ability to also mount 10 RP-3 unguided rockets. In the aircraft's final form, the Kangaroo had a 36-foot or 11-metre wingspan. It was 36 foot 3 inches or 11 metres long. The internal fuel capacity was 1,182 litres or 312 gallons. It had a maximum range of 2,540 miles or 4,088 kilometres. The top speed at sea level was 368 miles an hour or 592 kilometres, whilst at altitude it was 448 miles an hour or 721 kilometres an hour at 26,000 feet. Assigned the serial number A621001, the CA-15 began taxi test flights in February 1946. After a few modifications, the aircraft first flew on the 4th of March 1946 with test pilot Jim Schofield at the controls. The initial tests went well, although the ailerons were noted as being heavy. Aileron control was improved and numerous other refinements were made. Throughout the test flights, the CA-15 proved itself an easy aircraft to fly with excellent performance and very good visibility. After 16 hours of flight time, the CA-15 was handed over to the Royal Australian Air Force Aircraft Performance Unit. The landing gear struts were overpressurized, causing the CA-15 to bounce badly during taxi tests. This hopping action, earned it the unofficial nickname the Kangaroo, which has lasted over the years. Unfortunately, during a test flight on 10th of December 1946, a test gauge failed, resulted in the loss of all hydraulics. With no flaps and the unlocked gear partially extended, one of the test pilots was forced to make an emergency landing that damaged the aircraft's scoop and destroyed the wooden propeller. The failed gauge should have been removed before the aircraft was handed over to the Australian Air Force. However, at the time, the CA-15 had 43 hours flying, and the damage was not too severe. However, with the war over and jets coming into service, there was no possibility that the CA-15 was going to go into production. As a result, the repairs to the one-off prototype were slow, after initially being approved by the Cabinet in April of 1947. The CA-15 didn't fly again until May 1948, and it was now that the aircraft achieved its highest recorded speed of 502 miles an hour or 807 kilometers an hour after making a shallow dive. But with so many of the late war superprop aircraft, the CA-15's fate had long been sealed. The reason for the long delay in repairing the aircraft after its landing accident was the fact that it was already obsolete. And in 1946, the Royal Australian Air Force had already received its first jet fighter, the de Havilland Vampire. In 1950, Rolls-Royce wanted its engines back, which brought an end to the testing of the CA-15. The engine was removed and the CA-15 was scrapped, bringing an end to the highest performance aircraft ever designed and built in Australia. One can say it never bounced back after that incident. Subscribe for more.